Welcome to the Politics and Media Show with me, John Rees. Violent conflict between ethnic groups in Britain is inevitable, and it's even legitimate to prepare for armed conflict. These are the views revealed in a new report on far-right supporters. From Voting to Violence, Right-Wing Extremists in Modern Britain was released earlier this month. It found that a significant proportion of supporters of the British National Party and the English Defence League were ready and prepared to use violence. And as the following report explains, the findings will give fresh concern to Muslims, who are the main focus of the BNP and the EDL and their supporters.
A large number of far-right supporters in Britain believe that violent conflict between different ethnic, racial and religious groups is inevitable, and that it's even legitimate to prepare for armed conflict. This is the stark conclusion of a new report. From Voting to Violence, Right-Wing Extremists in Modern Britain was released yesterday in London. It questioned more than 2,000 supporters of far-right groups, including the anti-Muslim British National Party and the English Defence League. It found that nearly half were in favour of violence and were even ready to prepare for it. What we've got here is a group of people who self-identify as supporters of the far right, and who are, to quite a large extent, backing ideas about preparing for violence and appear to view violence as a justifiable political strategy. The report states, the responses point towards a tranche of BNP supporters who endorse the view that both preparing for and engaging in intergroup conflict are always justifiable actions. The BNP members in our sample appear to view themselves as a core vanguard who are preparing for a forthcoming conflict in a way that the party's more passive supporters are not. The findings will provide fresh concern for Muslims in the UK. EDL protests have regularly been held in areas with large Muslim populations and often have turned ugly. Meanwhile, Norway is preparing for the trial next month of Anders Breivik, the far-right extremist who has confessed to the murder of 77 people in Norway last July. In his online manifesto, Breivik declared that he carried out the attacks to help protect Europe from what he regards as a Muslim takeover. Breivik also revealed he'd had contact with far-right groups in the UK. In response, a spokesman for the BNP said, the party is committed to a democratic path and is against violence, but because the system is utterly rigged against us, there is a real danger that people are turning to a more radical course of action. Goodwin went on to say, these findings do not necessarily represent the views or policies of the parties themselves, but they are instructive as to the motivations and views of members and supporters. On one side, we have a far-right party, the BNP, disintegrating at elections and closing down any chance of a ballot box strategy. On the other, we have a more combative and confrontational form of street politics in the EDL. Then, for the first time in recent history, we have somebody in Breivik who has essentially offered a brand to would-be perpetrators of far-right violence. Our findings would appear to suggest that within this wider climate, and amidst continuing public anxiety over immigration, Islam and economic hardship, there is a significant section within the far-right who believe violence and armed conflict is a legitimate option should they feel their wider group is under threat. The study follows a report from the Home Affairs Select Committee earlier this year, which argued that there wasn't enough known about far-right extremism and its potential for violence. And Goodwin said his findings should be seen as a first step towards addressing that shortcoming, and warned that the far-right in the UK was now at a fork in the road.
Well, with me in the studio to discuss this is Sabby Dhalu, who's Joint Secretary of Unite Against Fascism, which has organised counter-protests against every EDL demonstration in the UK. We also have Tom Griffin from Spinwatch, an organisation which has been highlighting the rise of Islamophobia from the far right, including the BNP and the EDL. And we have Marley of Counterpoint. He's currently researching the project Capturing Europe's Reluctant Radicals, which is examining why people support xenophobic parties. Welcome to you all. Sabby, this report, not a surprise.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, firstly, if you look at far-right groups like the EDL and the BNP, it's not surprising that some of their supporters believe in violence, or that violence is inevitable, because the politics that these groups preach, a politics of hate, to some extent, its logical conclusion is, a violent reaction towards the groups that they dislike, such as immigrants and Muslims and so on. As far as terrorism is concerned, I mean, I think last year when the Norway terror attacks happened at the hands of Anders Breivik, I think some people were very surprised that it wasn't an Al-Qaeda type organisation behind these attacks and that it was a far-right group. But to those like myself and others involved in the anti-fascist movement, the anti-racist movement, we've been sort of following the activities of far-right organisations. And whilst there hasn't actually been a terror attack by far-right groups in the UK since the 1999 nail bombs by David Copeland in Brixton, Soho and Brick Lane, there have been numerous people of far-right organisations, former BNP members, who have been arrested, charged and convicted in relation to terror charges. There was quite a notorious one, Terence Gavin, at the beginning of 2010, who was sentenced to 12 years in prison for quite a serious who had explosives and so on and so forth. But I think the difference between the coverage of far-right violence and terrorism is that the level of Islamophobia in the media, in society, means that any Al-Qaeda type terror activity, even when there hasn't been a terror attack, but the mere discussion or arrest or charges brought against Al-Qaeda type extremists is always sort of front page news, but it's sort of not covered as much, so it's not surprising, no.
Tom, so is that your take that that there's a specific focus on supposed terror activity among the Muslim community, but you don't get the same kind of thing when it comes to the BNP and the EDL, despite the fact that this study has found that those tendencies exist?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I think what's particularly interesting about this study is it shows the overlap between the views of the extremist far right, the BNP, and what it calls the radical right, groups like UKIP and what have you. And I think that's something we have seen with the rise of Islamophobia, that it's allowed a sort of a cross-fertilisation to occur between the radical right and the far right. And we have seen, I think, the emergence of a very specific ideological tendency within the far right, which calls itself the counter-jihad movement, and that would certainly include groups like the EDL, and certainly Breivik was an adherent of the same ideas, ideas coming from people like Robert Spencer and Bat Yor, ideas like Eurabia and so on, the idea that there's a Muslim conspiracy to take over Europe, and that the left is part of that. But we have seen that those sorts of ideas also having an impact on sort of mainstream conservatism, which is one reason I think why it perhaps hasn't been covered as much in the mainstream media.
Marley, do you think, Tom was saying that this kind of thinking has had an impact on mainstream conservatism, but it would be maybe as true, if not more true, to say that the mainstream anti-Muslim discourse has created a space for these people to operate in the way they do?
Yeah, I think to some degree it goes both ways. I'd also like to say I think to some degree, the coverage of right-wing extremism is not. It's quite heavy. I mean, there's quite a lot of coverage. There's coverage right now. There's coverage in the mainstream media about this report, about previous reports by Demos and by previous reports at Chatham House. So there's been quite a lot of coverage about the far right, and I don't think it's understated, especially. I don't think that's the case, actually.
Sabby, what do you think? Is that the case, or would you say that the Marley's got a point there, that it does get the attention from the media in the way that the kind of preachers of hate stuff does?
I don't think so, no. I think if you compare, let's say, the Terence Gavin case, I mean, he was sentenced to 12 years in January 2010, and there was absolutely zero, on terrorism charges, and there's absolutely zero coverage in the mainstream media in terms of, it wasn't on TV headline news, it wasn't reported as headline news on, Sky, BBC, the normal news channels, and it wasn't, headline news of any of the print media. I think it was covered in something like, page 16. It was sort of buried in the news, whereas I think if there was a similar case in relation to some Al-Qaeda type terrorists, I think it would have been more headline news in mainstream media. So I think that there is a difference. And I think, secondly, a lot of platform is given to the far right and fascist organisations. So I think there's a difference between exposing and highlighting the problems of fascism and far right extremism, and then there's a difference between, you know, giving them profile and a platform, which I think the mainstream media has been guilty of, particularly, you know, quite serious, you know, news programmes like Newsnight, you know, as a flagship political programme of the BBC, and, you know, they've interviewed Tommy Robinson, you know, at least, you know, on 2 occasions, bizarrely, 3 days after the terror attacks in Norway, which was very distasteful as well as, you know, politically problematic from our point of view.
Tom, how would you assess the sort of balance of publicity here?
I think in terms of the coverage, I mean, I think part of the problem is that they get a certain amount of coverage, but there's a lack of understanding. I think that was the problem with Newsnight, in that they didn't expect Tommy Robinson to be as well briefed as he was. I think they slightly underestimated. Often what you find is that every time that the EDL, say, goes to Europe to meet with other parallel far-right groups, it's treated as the first time that they've done it as a sort of new departure for the EDL, whereas in fact that these kind of European contacts between, say, the Sweden Democrats and the Flemish far right and the EDL have been going on all along. So as far back as 2007, which was the first sort of European conference of the counter-jihad movement, which brought together, as I say, far right European parties with there was actually a UKIP representative there, so which underlines the point about the cross-fertilisation between different sections of the right around the issue of Islam.
So Marley, in terms of the sort of form that extremism is taking here, there's also there's a difference, isn't there? Because when there have been some people from a Muslim background, it's often been very small groups or even sole individuals unconnected to a political organisation. But this is something which is actually a part of, if not the whole of, an entire political organisation. That's quite an important distinction, do you think?
Yeah, and I think the larger organisations certainly have an impact on the smaller groups. I mean, there are sort of 2 possible ways of it working. There could be the situation where you have a large group that is actually perhaps in the mainstream, for instance, in the Netherlands, Geert Wilders, where you have potentially some extreme right, potentially violent supporters being emboldened by these groups because these are large groups that are legitimised by being in the mainstream. Or you could have the other case where people also argue where you have smaller, where you don't have a big mainstream right, and where someone like Breivik, for instance, who doesn't feel like he has a home to go to in a far-right organisation, then breaks out, and there's more potential for violence because they don't have an opportunity to participate in the democratic political process. I mean, I'm not sure, actually, personally, I'm not sure what is the greater danger, whether there's the legitimisation or whether there's also a danger for some far-right supporters to actually turn to violence because they don't feel like they have anywhere to go within the political system. I'm not sure either way.
Sabby, do you think there's any relationship between the kind of success of the far-right organisations electorally, which at the moment at any rate seems to have passed one of its peaks, and a turn to sort of violence inside them, or do you think that would happen anyway?
I think that it's no surprise that we're sort of that this report sort of found what it did in terms of the attitude towards violence, because I think to a certain extent the BNP's electoral decline last year, it averaged in the wards it contested 7.7%, which is incredibly low compared to what it has polled in previous years. That's a decade, low point. That's lower than what it achieved in 2003. So it's definitely sort of back right down to the levels it was polling, when it first began to emerge electorally. And so therefore, I do think that therefore within the far right, people are questioning, whether an electoral strategy, whether there's any merit or any success along that route. And so therefore, it's no surprise that we're seeing things like the English Defence League demonstrations and so on, which whilst they claim they're just peaceful protests, virtually all of them do lead to violence, not necessarily, or sometimes actually on their demonstrations, but sometimes even if the demonstration passes peacefully, there are almost always violent attacks on mosques or innocent Muslim and Asian communities following their demonstrations. So therefore, yeah, I think that some in the far right would be sort of turning perhaps towards more confrontational ways of expressing their politics, if you like. But at the precise moment in time, we're in quite an interesting situation, because actually it's a bit difficult to see which way things will turn, because the EDL have actually struggled to actually maintain momentum behind their mobilisations since they were sort of defeated, really, and out-mobilised in Tower Hamlets in September last year. They haven't actually managed to mobilise the level of the size of the demonstrations that they did, let's say, back in Luton in February last year. They had around 2,000 to 3,000 people, and they had about 1,000 in Tower Hamlets, and they've got less than 500 on demonstrations since then. They've got another demonstration coming up in Luton, so it'll be interesting to see how many they mobilise there. But with the situation is sort of somewhat in flux, I would say, because there are the EDL has formally agreed to participate in something called the British Freedom Party. Now, it remains to be seen whether they actually stand candidates in this year's elections. Obviously, the big set of elections will be the London Assembly elections for them to test the ground, but it's unclear whether they will actually stand a candidate, because obviously we have also Richard Barnbrook, a former BNP member, no longer in the BNP. He's a sitting candidate, and so they'll obviously inevitably split the vote. So they may decide tactically it's best not to target this set of elections. But nevertheless, they certainly, the EDL has formally agreed to participate in this British Freedom Party political outfit, which would intend to target elections. And I suppose the best way of describing it is perhaps a Geert Wilders style political party, which focuses mainly on Islam as opposed to racism more generally. Whereas that's right. Yeah. The BNP is sort of seen as more of a racist organisation, whereas I think they would sort of attempt to particularly focus on Islam, given the level of Islamophobia right now.
So, Tom, how do you see this? Because it is quite a complex picture. On the one hand, the BNP, which has been the most successful, fascist outfit in Britain for some time, was launched specifically on the kind of Euro-fascist model that we were going to stop the street fighting or minimise the street fighting. We were going to, copy Le Pen in France and go for the electoral strategy. That seems to be at a low point, as Sabby says, but. What would you think the consequences would be? Would that produce a more violent reaction again, as it has done sometimes in the past, or do you think they'll try and, as perhaps Sabby's suggesting, reformulate the electoral strategy to include some of the people that have been doing the street fighting, like the EDL?
Well, I mean, it's interesting, as Sabby says about the British Freedom Party, that in itself sort of represents a cross-fertilisation of these different sort of strands coming together. Because, I mean, initially it was the first wave of the British Freedom Party was people coming out of the BNP with sort of traditional far-right fascist, extremely virulently anti-Semitic background. And then you have it coming together with the EDL and with the new leader who's come from UKIP, Paul Weston, who's from a very sort of pro-Israel position. So you have huge contradictions within that party, but that's really representative of what's happening right across Europe, as sort of the traditional far right sort of coming together with conservatives from the US to create a sort of transatlantic sort of Islamophobic movement, that the British Freedom Party would be an example of that. But because of those huge internal contradictions, I think there's a real opportunity there to sort of take the fight to them around it.
Let me bring Marley in about this then, because do you think that this sort of recomposition of the far right will it increase the tendency, which clearly the report indicates, towards more violence, or do you think that perhaps the dominant trend will be to recoalesce the far right around Islamophobia, or do you think both will happen at the same time?
Well, I'm not actually convinced that this revisioning of the far right in the UK, if it goes ahead, is actually going to succeed. I mean, I don't see. I mean, for many years now, the far right has been really a failed case in the UK, and I think that probably, I can't say for sure, but I think it will continue to happen. Just because I think that the conditions in the UK, even though you do have very high levels of anti-immigration sentiment and all the kind of that public attitudes are there, you also have other conditions that aren't in place for the far right or for the populist right to thrive. You have things like a cemented class structure that I think makes it very hard for right-wing populism to thrive. I mean, you know, UKIP and the BNP, they've always had a very limited amount of support, and I think, you know, even with a branching out by the far right into more populist right territory, I think we'll still have that struggle to kind of gain large support, like in the Netherlands, like in France, like in Austria. I just think the UK is a different case to these countries, and I think it'll be very hard for these kind of parties to get that level of support, you know, up to 15-20% of the vote.
Well, we did ask UKIP to come on, but they declined, which would have been a more interesting discussion, perhaps. Sabby, last question in this section of the programme. Do you think that's true? Do you think there are sort of almost sociological blocks to the development of a successful far right in Britain?
Well, I think it's certainly the case that obviously the far right in Britain haven't done anywhere near as well as their European counterparts. That is certainly true. However, I do think there's a danger of complacency, because at the same time we're not immune to this threat either. I think some people were surprised by the level of support that the BNP was able to gain. You know, the fact that they were, you know, able to poll, you know, all of these councillors in places like Barking and Dagenham. I mean, that's quite a lot of councillors, 12 councillors in one borough, is very worrying. So they're certainly electorally in decline at the moment. But I think that we have to be vigilant, and we have to maintain a campaign and a movement against these organisations, because you could get, I mean, traditionally in Britain, the far right have always sort of done better or gained more support under a Labour government than a Conservative government. So there's always a danger that, you know, Labour could come into power, and it does sort of coincide with, you know, a decline in support for the Conservative Party. If you look at in the northern towns where the BNP was able to break through or do well, it was always in areas where there'd actually been some Tory decline long term. So that there was no sort of right-wing, you know, political party. So as soon as the BNP emerged, that was the only sort of right-wing expression politically. So I think it remains to be seen. I think certainly in Britain is unique in a good way, because whilst perhaps things have taken a bit of a turn for the worse over the last decade, it is still much better in terms of on issues like multiculturalism and anti-racism. You know, Britain is much better. At least there's a discourse here where there is discussion here, with people saying actually different faiths, different cultures contribute positively to British society. And, you know, MEPs, you know, tell us, you know, this discussion does not take place in other European countries. So certainly, you know, we are in a better position than other European countries, but I think we do have to be vigilant and maintain a campaign against such organisations rather than be, you know, taken by surprise.
Okay, well, that's all we have time for in this programme. My thanks to Sabby, Tom, Marley for contributing to this discussion, and please do come back for part 2, where there'll be a more interesting debate on some related issues about lawfare, the attack on the libel laws and the change in the libel laws, partly in response to questions of racism. Welcome back to part 2 of the Politics and Media Show. Jewish students at Leeds University have cancelled the appearance of an American lawyer over concerns that she's too controversial. New York-based Brooke Goldstein toured Britain last week, speaking about the ways in which Arab dictatorships and Islamist leaders use what she describes as lawfare to sue those who publish articles against radical Islam. She was due to speak at Leeds University, but according to reports, students withdrew her invitation at 48 hours' notice. They were apparently concerned over her association with far-right Dutch politician Geert Wilders, whom she gave legal advice to after he was sued for anti-Muslim remarks. The incident comes as British libel law could be about to change. The government has said that it will make changes to introduce a single publication rule and to reduce so-called libel tourism, and has proposed several changes to procedure and existing defences. The term libel tourism was coined after a prominent Saudi businessman, Khaled bin Mahfouz, sued Rachel Ehrenfeld, an Israeli-born writer and US citizen, over her 2003 book on terrorist funding, Funding Evil, which asserted that Mahfouz and his family provided financial support to terrorist groups. The case was brought in Britain and Ehrenfeld was forced to pay compensation. But it has now led to calls for the libel law reform in the UK, where the government is currently scrutinising the law. Well, with me to discuss this is Sarah Colborne from the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. Welcome to the programme, Sarah.
Thanks for having
So
me.
just explain a little bit about what is this lawfare?
Well, Brooke Goldstein, first, just to put it in context, she's director of an organisation called the Lawfare Project. And so the action that was taken by Leeds University students, the way that it was reported in the press, is not simply because of her association with far-right politicians, but actually on the statements that she has made. Because as a lawyer, she obviously can defend all sorts of people, but it's what she has actually said herself and what her project does that was so controversial. Lawfare has been described by people like Brooke Goldstein as an asymmetrical form of warfare. So what they have said is that people who use legal measures to try and challenge crimes, international war crimes, such as the crime that Israel committed in Gaza during Operation Cast Lead, that ability of people to seek justice in the courts, they equate that with terrorism and warfare. That's the reason why they use the word lawfare. And
Okay, so just let me see if I've got this straight. So essentially, the political case is that we've been saying to these groups for decades that they should come within the legal processes. When they do come within the legal processes, then their legal activity is described as a kind of extension of terrorist activity.
correct. And it's about, because obviously people who have not got they've not got F-16s, they've not got they've not got a heavily armed state behind them, do not have recourse to the sort of measures that the Israeli government have, and the only power they have is to resist in ways that they have resisted so far, and to take legal action against those responsible for massacres and crimes against humanity. And what Brooke Goldstein and what the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for example, and other agencies such as that are claiming is that somehow taking legal action to remedy and to bring to justice those responsible for those crimes is hindering the ability of states such as Israel to carry out the military actions they want to carry out, and that somehow that they have equated this as a form of terrorism. So this precisely what you're saying is correct, that even trying to take this through the courts, even for example trying to get arrest warrants for people like Tzipi Livni when they come to Britain, is a form of lawfare, and that is where they're trying to move the debate, that somehow any form of defending yourself against the crimes that can be imposed upon a 1.6 million people in Gaza, for example, is something that has to be objected to and vigorously opposed by Israel and by organisations such as the Lawfare Project. So it's an attempt to try and remove international law from the framework within which Israel operates.
So do you think that this is the product of I would say a 10-year period now, when the public mood has been moving away from sympathy with the State of Israel and towards sympathy with the Palestinians, that this has now opened up opportunities within the kind of civil society and legal field, which perhaps didn't exist previously? This is an attempt to roll that back, do you think?
Absolutely, and it's an attempt to try and remove the reality of the crimes that have been committed against Palestinians from the agenda. So, for example, the situation with Tzipi Livni, which people will remember, I'm sure your viewers will remember, the reason why an arrest warrant was granted against Tzipi Livni is because of the overwhelming evidence against her, all of the crimes that were committed during Operation Cast Lead and her role as one of the trio that orchestrated Operation Cast Lead. And what Israel is trying to do is trying to say, well, OK, there's all this evidence, but we're not even going to go there. We want to just give Tzipi Livni and other Israeli war criminals complete immunity from prosecution. And we need to do this because we are going to continue further attacks against the Palestinians or against whatever, the threats against Iran are another case in point. And it's about Israel trying to decouple itself from any form of international legal remedy against its attacks.
I mean, it's an interesting moment then, because the whole discourse of the major powers, for their own purposes, has been to, if you like, legalise the business of warfare by arguing that it's a humanitarian intervention, that these people have got to go to the International Criminal Court, The Hague, and even though the United States isn't signed up to it, but that's been the drift of kind of the imperial powers' ideology over this question. So it's quite interesting that Israel finds it's necessary to detach itself even from that.
Well, it's quite interesting because immediately after Operation Cast Lead, the discourse very much from the Israelis is we have to change international law. We have to allow states such as Israel to bomb civilian population in Gaza. They obviously have changed that discourse from one of changing the actual structure of international law to decoupling from international law totally. And I think that reflects the fact that it's impossible to justify legally what Israel has done and what Israel continues to do to the Palestinian population.
And do you think that this is becoming a powerful or a significant, the whole lawfare argument, powerful or significant voice, or are we dealing with people who are really at the margins of the sort of legal debate?
I think we are dealing with people at the margins of legal debate. However, the danger is that we're dealing with people who are advocating on behalf of a state that has either the fourth or the fifth most powerful army in the world. But this all is a reflection of the fact that public support, public sympathy for Palestinians is at a level that we've never seen before. There's an instinctive support amongst the population internationally for justice, for human rights, for equality. And I think that's what people who identify with those values identify with the Palestinian cause. And they're wanting to see an end to the suffering of the Palestinians. And I think what's interesting about what's going on in Palestine at the moment is that you're seeing non-violent movements as well, peaceful movements being attacked by the Israeli armed forces. And so the Israeli armed forces are giving a very clear message to the Palestinians. There is no way that legally we will allow you to resist Israeli occupation. And increasingly, the international solidarity is growing for the Palestinian because they are seeing that Palestinians who are protesting every Friday against the Israeli wall are being met with tear gas, with rubber bullets, and people are dying on those protests. And so what Israel, I think, is responding to is that the lack of support and sympathy for its continuing attacks on the Palestinians. When you've got a situation where even Melanie Phillips has said Israel has lost the battle of public opinion, that just shows where the solidarity movement has got to.
And also, there seems to be, I mean, as a result of the Arab revolutions, Israel has. Well, the least we could say is that Egypt is no longer as fully supportive of US policy towards Israel as it was under Mubarak. Turkey, for its own reasons, has had to, in order to effectively intervene in the process of the Arab revolutions, has had to take a stronger anti-Israel stance. So diplomatically, as well as at the level of popular mobilisation, Israel is probably more isolated than it's been conceivably at any time. Mm.
And I think that is very interesting. Obviously, the process in Egypt is still developing. We have the elections coming, and obviously the situation with Turkey is that Turkey have placed very clear demands on Israel, and that's for an apology for its massacre of its citizens on the Mavi Marmara, for compensation, but most importantly for an end to the siege on Gaza, because in all of these discussions we have around Israel, frequently in the media, not on the Islam Channel, but on other elements of the media, there has not been an investigation as to why, for example, why the convoys and why the flotilla went to Gaza. The root cause, which is Israeli occupation, and so I think that's been very important that the Turkish government have stood up very strongly and said we need to see an end to the siege on Gaza.
And there's another large-scale protest being planned later in the year, isn't there?
Well, actually, it's the end of this month. We have the Global March to Jerusalem, which is a very important initiative. Again, this is a peaceful protest that's going to be taking place inside Palestine and also in the states surrounding Palestine, so Jordan, Lebanon. And what that will be a peaceful mass mobilisation calling for Jerusalem to be a city for all. At the moment, we have a situation where there is extreme ethnic cleansing taking place inside Jerusalem, where Palestinian citizens of Jerusalem are being driven out of their homes, where their right to worship for Palestinian Christians and Muslims is being denied. And so what these demonstrations are going to be calling on, and there'll be one at 5 p.m. Outside the Israeli embassy in London here, all those protests will be calling on the 30th of March for Jerusalem as a city of all, as a city for peace. It has incredible significance for the Palestinian people and for humanity as a whole. And so those peaceful protests will be calling for Jerusalem to be respected as a city for all. And there'll be Muslims, Christians, Jews, all uniting on that day to call for support for Jerusalem as a free city.
Do you think it's that kind of protest then that the lawfare thing is finding so difficult to deal with? Because you'll be aware the report that was given to the Israeli cabinet I think last year said actually specifically about London that we've got a problem, we've got a publicity problem, partly as they put it because of the Red-Green alliance, the alliance between Muslims and the left, and it seems that the lawfare thing may be then something which is trying to claw ground that's been lost on this front back by legal means.
Absolutely, it's an attempt to legitimise legal remedies. And it's an attempt to delegitimise actually international law. And because the problem is that Israel is in violation of so many aspects of the Fourth Geneva Convention. It consistently violates UN resolutions. And the problem for Israel is that it's found it's so impossible to unpick that and to lay a new legal framework to justify what it does, that it would rather demonise and delegitimise those people who are saying actually there needs to be a framework. There needs to be a framework based on international law, on justice, on equality, and on freedom. And having that basis gives you peace. And the problem for Israel is that it is unwilling to accept that for peace it needs to give Palestinians freedom, equality, and justice.
Interesting in the Leeds case that it was the Jewish students that moved against this meeting taking place, because although, as we all know, there are many anti-Zionist Jews, Leeds University has often not been a centre for that particular strand of opinion. So perhaps the lawfare thing is a step too far for many people.
I think it's very difficult to justify completely decoupling any sort of legal framework. And I think what's interesting as well is the developments within the Jewish community on the question of Israel, because it's increasingly difficult to justify what the Israeli government is doing to Palestinians. And that's, I think, it's a very positive sign that Leeds University Jewish Student Society took this decision. And it reflects the fact that people do want to have there's an overwhelming majority that support some framework of international law, some framework of justice, and the idea of inviting someone over to speak in a student union that has such an extreme position around lawfare that really calls lawfare an asymmetric form of warfare. It isn't it isn't something that we would want to see in student unions, and I do think that this is a positive development that that inside the Jewish community as well there are increasingly strong voices coming out supporting human rights for Palestinians.
So you're saying really that this is indicative of a wider mood in the Jewish community, which is anti-Zionist, which is pro-Palestinian. Is it worthwhile kind of quantify that? Would you say that the sort of level of support has perhaps doubled over 10 years among Jews, or is that difficult to say?
I think it's very difficult to quantify, but what I think is important to see are organisations such as Jews for Justice for Palestinians have been growing. Protests that have been supportive of Israel's crimes. For example, I know I keep going back to it, but Operation Cast Lead, that was the end of 2008, beginning of 2009. And there was one protest that was called to defend Israel's actions against the Palestinians in Gaza, and it was tiny. And mainstream Jewish opinion did not support that protest because I think that, I mean, again, it's the point I keep coming back to about equality and justice and human rights are something that it's a bedrock for most people internationally.
And do you think that that the statements that Israel has been making about Iran now, I mean, most recently the meeting that Benjamin Netanyahu had with President Obama, where he was, reported to a global audience as being very hawkish on the necessity of an attack on Iran, that must, among the population in general, but also among people who in the Jewish community have supported the State of Israel in the past, must look like incendiary action, do you think?
Yeah, I think the other thing that Netanyahu, this has received less reporting, but Netanyahu actually did say Gaza is Iran. And so this links back to the attack that was launched on Gaza, where you actually had a policy that Israel has of extrajudicial assassinations carried out upon Palestinians. If I just get, and this relates all back to the lawfare element as well, because what Israel is actually doing is assassinating people who have not even been through any legal process, and so the Israeli government is avoiding bringing people to justice. Instead, they are just assassinating them. And what's happening is that whilst they're assassinating them, they are also killing many other Palestinian men, women and children at the same time. And that's what happened a couple of weeks ago in Gaza. And this statement that Gaza is Iran is incredibly worrying as well. So although there is obviously the rhetoric increasing around an attack on Iran, there are also the constant attacks that take place upon Palestinians living in Gaza.
Okay. Well, that's all we've had time for. My thanks to Sarah Colborne from the Palestine Solidarity Campaign for joining me in this discussion. Thank you for watching, and I hope that you'll be back with us next week for another edition of the Politics and Media Show.